The mist swallowed Venice whole. Gondolas drifted like lost ghosts over black water that reflected nothing, and masks leaned close, whispering secrets not meant for human ears. Every step, every breath, every heartbeat was measured, and those who lingered vanished, leaving only ripples and echoes behind. Can you hear the whispers calling your name? The city of Venice had been swallowed by a mist so dense it seemed to devour the light of every lantern, leaving streets and canals indistinguishable from shadows. Gondolas drifted silently over water that reflected nothing of the sky, no stars, no crescent moon, only the faintest undulations that moved against the current as if the canals themselves were breathing. Along every quay and bridge, masks shimmered beneath the pallid glow of lanterns, their painted smiles frozen in expressions that were not those of the living. From behind the painted visages, whispers slipped out, soft and curling, repeating syllables that had never been spoken, secrets belonging to lives long past, or perhaps lives yet to come. Those who lingered too long felt the mist curl and tighten around their ankles, a cold, teasing pressure that brushed upward with deliberate curiosity, coaxing and daring, as though the fog itself wished to measure fear. When footsteps faltered, the fog pressed higher, flowing around knees, then thighs, until the body seemed suspended in a liquid silence, and the first screams cut off abruptly, leaving nothing but the faint tremor of ripples across black water. The air carried the faint metallic tang of water disturbed not by wind, but by some unseen rhythm beneath the surface. Gondoliers shivered on their benches, oars idle, the currents resisting their efforts as if the canals had grown sentient and sought to gather attention in their own measured tempo. Every bridge arch became a frame for shadow, every column along the quay a witness, its carved stone faces tilted downward, eyes hollow, observing the way humans moved when terror brushed their shoulders. The whispers grew in audibility as the night deepened, layered voices overlapping, repeating themselves in fractal patterns, phrases familiar yet alien, intimate in their accusation. Those who paused, even for the briefest moment, felt the weight of unseen scrutiny, the sense that each heartbeat, each tremor of breath, was counted and catalogued by a presence older than the stones themselves. The masks responded, tilting subtly toward the living, their smiles widening or curving with angles impossible to reconcile, the whispers forming chains of thought no human mind should comprehend. The mist thickened along narrow alleys, curling in spirals that trailed behind wandering citizens, brushing their sleeves and the hems of gowns, following the curve of every cane and the swing of every lantern. A man walking alone along the Canal Grande became aware that the reflections in the water no longer matched his movements. They lagged slightly, hesitated, then moved independently, as if testing his recognition, his attention, his very understanding of reality. When he stopped to peer more closely, the mist rose suddenly to waist height, then chest, a smooth, deliberate ascent, and then he was gone, leaving only his gondola spinning slowly in place, tethered to nothing, as though the water had swallowed his weight but refused to disturb the surface. Somewhere across the city, a faint echo of a scream resonated, but it had no source, bouncing between walls of mist and bridges, dissolving before it could reach ears willing to hear. The night deepened further, the lanterns flickering against the mist in pale halos that seemed to float unattached to any support. Masks leaned closer to faces, shadows stretching unnaturally across stone and water, and whispers threaded through the streets, repeating names, fragmenting memories, unraveling thought. Each footstep left no mark, or when marks appeared in the damp stones, they curled upward like tendrils, disappearing before anyone could trace their path. Venice had become both predator and stage, its canals holding a rhythm measured in breath, in fear, in absence, and the city waited. It waited for those who lingered too long, those who dared to recognize the voices, to feel the pull of the mist, to acknowledge the unnatural stillness beneath the lapping water. By the hour before midnight, every sense of certainty had been stripped, every instinct tested, leaving only the pulse of the canals and the whispered knowledge that those who yielded to the fog were already claimed, absorbed into the rhythm, and would never return. By the hour of the wolf, Venice had surrendered to a quiet madness. The canals no longer mere channels of water, but living veins, pulsing with a deliberate rhythm, as though tasting the air for the presence of fear. The mist, thicker now, pressed along every stone quay and beneath every arching bridge, curling in slow, deliberate spirals that sought the soles of shoes, the hems of gowns, the edges of every gloved hand. Masks leaned impossibly close to cheeks, painted eyes tilting with a subtle animation that suggested thought, a second life behind lacquered surfaces. Whispers layered atop one another in a discordant, inhuman chorus, fragmenting into syllables that slithered along the skin, winding around the mind, revealing secrets the wearers had never dared confess even to themselves. Voices spoke of debts unpaid, loves betrayed, sins of ancestors long turned to dust, and those who paused felt an almost magnetic pull, an involuntary gravitation toward the mist, as if the air itself measured the weight of hesitation and fed upon it. A gondolier whose hands had once been steady found his grip faltering, the oar slipping slightly with each stroke, yet the water beneath him no longer responded to his effort. The surface shimmered in concentric rings that spread outward from no visible source, touching each gondola in turn, as though the canals themselves had grown a pulse, alive and patient, surveying every breath, every unspoken thought. The lanterns suspended along the bank swayed, though no wind moved them, casting fragmented light that painted the mist in shifting, spectral patterns. Shadows lengthened unnaturally, climbing walls, curling along the ground, tracing paths that contradicted the steps of those walking beneath them. Every movement seemed anticipated, every hesitation measured, evaluated, catalogued. Fear itself became a current, and the canals responded. A man paused beneath the stone arch of Ponte dei Sospiri, ears straining to catch a phrase, a syllable that might explain the low, persistent whispering curling from every mask, every reflection on water, every shadow. The mist rose like living silk, brushing against his calves, climbing his knees, winding to his chest in a smooth, patient tide that did not burn, did not choke, but rather coaxed him into stillness. Time slowed in that silence. The interval between breaths stretched, until the man felt the weight of the city pressing downward, the pulse of the canals aligning with the beat of his heart, each oscillation a reminder that he had ceased to belong entirely to the world he knew. A tremor ran through the wood of his gondola, imperceptible yet enough to unsettle the senses, and then he was gone, swallowed by mist so complete it left only a ripple on water that seemed to linger, suspended against the pull of gravity, spinning in place as though tethered to nothing, yet somehow held in the careful embrace of the fog. Along the Canal Grande, the remaining citizens moved with a hesitant rhythm, their steps tentative as if the cobblestones themselves might vanish beneath their feet, leaving them adrift in an invisible current. The mist had thickened to the point where lantern light was smeared into dull halos, floating unattached in the air, failing to illuminate the facades of palaces, bridges, or statues that once guided the eye. Masks in the crowd now murmured in overlapping cadences, voices from many faces converging in low hums, syllables indistinct but heavy with intent. The whispers were not confined to ears. They brushed along collars, trailed over the backs of necks, vibrating faintly through skin and bone in ways that unsettled memory, leaving the mind aware of unspoken truths, of lines drawn across past choices, of shadows of deeds never witnessed but recorded by the city itself. Each echo fed the mist, thickening it, giving it form, purpose, and a deliberate patience. Bridges seemed to shift imperceptibly as the night deepened, arches elongating, parapets curling inwards, confusing all perception of distance and direction. Footsteps along the stones became deceptive, leaving impressions that twisted upon themselves, doubling back into the mist, erasing the confidence of movement, the sense of home, the certainty of paths long walked. Lanterns reflected faces not their own, eyes that blinked independently of the owner, smiles stretched too wide, features altered subtly to suggest intent, knowledge, awareness beyond human comprehension. The water itself resisted oars, shifting beneath every boat in uneven pulses, breaking reflections into jagged shards of movement that mirrored not the city but the fears of those who wandered it. Fear was a language, and the canals had become fluent. A group of masked revelers, drifting along the quieter back canals, became aware that the reflections in the water lagged, repeating gestures, curling hands, tilting heads with a fraction of delay, as though mocking their attempts to navigate the night. The mist gathered around their gondola in coils, pressing against the sides, lifting faintly under the hull, as though the water beneath was alive, tasting the fear that radiated from their hearts. Lanterns swung without wind, painting long shadows that traced the edges of the boat, tracing the edges of their masks, their movements amplified and exaggerated in the fog. Each echo of breath, each tremor of hand, became a note in a subtle symphony conducted by the canals, conducted by the unseen. By the hour before midnight, Venice had ceased to be the city it had been for centuries. Every step was uncertain, every glance misleading, every reflection untrustworthy. The mist pulsed like the slow heartbeat of a beast beneath the water, tender yet patient, deliberate yet indifferent. Masks leaned closer to the living, tilting with intent, whispering phrases that twisted the mind, revealing sins that were not yet sins, crimes uncommitted, loves unspoken. Gondolas floated adrift, tethered to nothing, as if the canals themselves had claimed them as guardians or prey. The citizens no longer moved with intention. They drifted in rhythm with the pulse beneath, their thoughts echoing in the fog, swallowed slowly, catalogued, measured, absorbed into the silent memory of the city. And in the quiet spaces between canals, under arches that had once echoed with laughter and song, only the whispers remained, endless and patient, layered atop one another, a chorus of the vanished, a language not meant for human ears, but meant to teach understanding through the slow, inescapable measurement of fear. Venice had become a city of reflection, of rhythm, of mist, and the canals had begun their patient work, testing each heartbeat, counting each breath, waiting for those who lingered too long to yield completely, and in yielding, to vanish. The carnival had shifted from a celebration into something deliberate, a predator that observed with patience older than stone and water. Masks no longer rested idly on faces. They tilted, angled, and leaned with uncanny intent, their painted expressions catching each whisper, each hesitation, each heartbeat betrayed. The city itself seemed to pulse in tandem with the fog, the canals carrying it like veins flowing with a slow, deliberate current that tasted fear as one might taste salt or blood. St. Mark's belfry rang in the dead of night, though no hand moved to strike the bells, and each toll stretched unnaturally, curling through empty streets like smoke that refused to dissipate, winding into alleys and over bridges with a weight that pressed upon the chest and slowed the pulse. Those who fled, seeking the solace of familiar paths, found the city reshaped around them. Bridges had lengthened, parapets arched in impossible curves, alleyways spiraled into new directions, and every step became uncertain, leaving the mind grasping at vanished certainty. The dogs and cats, creatures that once patrolled streets with habitual ease, vanished into the fog, their absence leaving alleys eerily empty, the air vibrating with the memory of movement that had once existed but was no longer. The mist thickened in layers, curling against walls and over balconies, forming tendrils that reached for sleeves, collars, and cloaks. Those who moved beneath the arches of old palaces felt the fog press upward, soft and deliberate, coiling around knees, thighs, chest, brushing against the skin with a chill that did not bite but insinuated itself into thought, teasing with the subtle suggestion of inevitability. Masks leaned closer to faces, painted eyes tilting unnaturally, smiles curving impossibly, their silent whispers pressing into the mind without sound. Voices intertwined, overlapping, fragmenting into dissonant harmonics that mimicked the thoughts of the living, dragging memories into the fog, revealing fears unacknowledged even to the wearers themselves. A merchant stepping onto the Rialto Bridge felt his reflection linger in the water too long, tilting its head with a fraction of a second delay, tracing motions he had not yet made, the lag of recognition rippling through his thoughts like a wave of nausea. The mist rose higher, tugging at the edges of his cloak, brushing his hair across his eyes, and he felt the first sharp pinch of panic, a pulse that accelerated against the measured rhythm of the city, and then he was gone. His gondola drifted, spinning slowly in place, tethered to nothing, a silent vessel in a sea of fog and whispered memory. Along the quieter canals, masked figures floated in slow, cautious rhythm, their oars hesitant, the water beneath them pulsing subtly with unseen currents. Lanterns hung along the quays, floating in pale halos that cast no true light, reflecting faces not their own, eyes that blinked independently, mouths that whispered in unrecognizable tones. The buildings leaned imperceptibly, tilting inward as though listening, their windows and balconies framing shadows that moved against the architecture, tracing lines that contradicted human motion. Each step became a negotiation with unseen forces, each glance a test. The city recorded everything, the hesitation of hand, the falter of gaze, the slight quiver of breath, and the canals responded, rippling in measured, unrelenting patterns, coaxing the living to linger too long, to notice what should not be noticed, to recognize what should remain hidden. Bells tolled again, though no hand moved. The echoes snaked along alleys and piazzas, curling around arches, vibrating along stone in slow spirals, and in the moments between, whispers filled the silence, growing in clarity, layering voices of the lost atop one another. A painter navigating a narrow canal felt the walls close subtly, the mist rising from the water like tendrils, brushing against his sleeves, neck, and cheeks. Shadows danced along the sides of buildings, leaning forward, tilting, stretching, and the reflections in the canal mirrored not the painter but a version of him twisted, smiling too widely, eyes too bright, head tilted in impossible angles. The air thickened, carrying the subtle metallic tang of unspent fear, an undertone that pressed against eardrums and slowed thought. Every heartbeat became audible to the city, every shiver of skin catalogued, measured, stored for a later reckoning. The carnival's predator had learned to be subtle, patient, unhurried. The fog no longer merely covered the streets but shaped them, elongating alleys, raising steps imperceptibly, shifting bridges by fractions of a pace, until the city itself seemed to bend to the will of the mist. Masks leaned inward, whispering in tones that mixed past and future, sins and unspoken intentions, promises and betrayals, and those who listened too closely felt their own thoughts unravel, delicate threads pulled into knots by the soft insistence of unseen voices. Gondolas drifted in circles, tethered to nothing, moving in rhythms dictated by currents beneath the surface that had grown sentient, tasting hesitation, measuring terror, marking each soul that lingered too long in the city of masks. By the hour after midnight, the streets were empty except for drifting vessels, the fog thick and patient, pressing into the corners of alleys and under bridges, brushing against every stone and surface with deliberate weight. Masks had become almost autonomous, tilting, leaning, whispering with voices borrowed from those who had vanished, speaking secrets no living ear should hear. Every reflection in the water carried subtle distortions, faces lingering too long, shadows moving contrary to their sources, and the canals pulsed steadily beneath them, tasting, measuring, cataloging. The bells tolled again, stretching impossibly, curling through the fog like smoke that refused to dissipate, marking not hours but the passage of lives into absence. Venice had become an organism of observation and appetite, patient, deliberate, measuring, waiting for the moment when the living would falter entirely, leave their reflections behind, and vanish into the rhythm of the night, absorbed by the carnival that had learned to hunt without body, without claw, without flame, leaving only ripples, whispers, and the eternal pulse of the mist. Midnight draped Venice in a blanket of silence, so complete it pressed against the chest like water, heavy and unyielding. The Grand Canal, once a mirror of stars and lantern light, had become a black expanse that refused reflection, a dark artery pulsing with slow, deliberate rhythms beneath every gondola adrift. Gondoliers, hands pale and trembling, abandoned oars that seemed to resist motion, stiffened by currents they could not see, leaving vessels to float in place as shadows rose like hands from the depths, brushing against hulls and heels, tasting hesitation and fear. Lanterns swayed without wind, casting elongated halos across the water, illuminating masks that leaned toward the living with intent, painted faces twisting into subtle expressions that suggested thought, memory, and secret knowledge. The whispers began in threads, tiny and almost imperceptible, voices borrowed from other lives murmuring betrayals unspoken, crimes unconfessed, loves unrequited, names that had long been buried beneath stones, beneath silence, beneath the careful patience of the city itself. Those who listened too closely felt a line drawn across the mind, an invisible tally marking each hesitation, each falter of thought, each beat of the heart that betrayed more than flesh alone. The fog rolled thicker, curling along facades, climbing walls, and pressing across balconies with a chill that did not bite but insinuated itself into bone, settling in joints and behind eyes, threading the mind with the weight of inevitability. Shadows elongated unnaturally, detaching from lanterns, from arches, from the movement of human feet, and for those who paused to notice, the reflections in the water no longer corresponded. Faces lingered too long, eyes blinking independently, smiles tilting with awareness, and each ripple on the water's surface carried the echo of absence, of those who had walked too slowly, lingered too long, or allowed curiosity to bloom where prudence should have held sway. The city breathed in measured pulses, counting and cataloging every hesitation, and those pulses aligned in slow, deliberate waves with the rhythm of fear itself. Along the quieter canals, masks shifted, leaning closer, tilting in gestures imperceptible yet deliberate, whispering names not their own, recounting moments that had never belonged to their wearers. A painter navigating the labyrinth of alleys felt the water beneath his gondola lift and fall with subtle, intelligent patterns, currents circling him as if tasting the decision to pause, the thought of looking too closely, the faintest wish to listen. Every whispered syllable left a trace, a scar on memory, as though the city itself wrote with invisible ink across the mind, cataloging every unspoken truth. Reflections no longer mirrored the living but their shadows, elongated, twisted, moving in counterpoint to gestures, tilting heads in mockery, smiling with delayed recognition, and the painter's breath caught in the throat, each inhale measured by something vast beneath the dark water, measuring, observing, recording. Bridges shifted imperceptibly, parapets curling inward, arches lengthening, tilting to guide or mislead, bending the city to the will of the night and the hunger of the mist. Each alleyway spiraled in impossible curves, forcing steps into hesitation, retracing paths that seemed familiar yet never arrived at home. Lanterns hung like floating eyes, light dimmed and refracted by the fog, painting shadows that stretched along facades and water, twisting familiar forms into subtle distortions of comprehension. Every heartbeat became audible, measured against the slow, relentless pulse of the canals, and those who moved against it felt the currents tug subtly, coaxing bodies, minds, and memories toward the water, toward the mist, toward absence. A merchant on the Rialto Bridge felt the fog press upward against his sleeves and collar, rising to shoulders, brushing hair across eyes, soft and deliberate, as though it knew every sinew of thought. Whispers from the masks flowed in threads that wrapped around memory, revealing sins uncommitted, love unspoken, and the half-forgotten betrayals of ancestors. The water beneath the gondolas pulsed in response, undulating in measured waves that aligned with the tremors of the mind, tasting hesitation, cataloging fear. Every reflection lagged slightly, tilting heads, widening eyes, smiling with delay, and in that delay, in that imperfection, the city recorded the passage of consciousness, noting those who faltered and those who moved too quickly to be observed fully. By the hour approaching the first toll of 1, Venice had ceased to be recognizable as the city of centuries past. Streets, canals, bridges, and alleys had bent subtly to an intelligence older than memory, a patience deeper than stone. Masks leaned toward faces in the crowd, whispering phrases from lives not their own, speaking in harmonics that slid along skin and bone, tugging at thought and memory, threading awareness with gentle insistence, until the living began to mirror absence. Gondolas drifted in slow, circular patterns, tethered to nothing, guided by currents beneath the surface that had grown conscious, patient, deliberate. Lanterns floated, casting light that illuminated shadows moving contrary to their sources, reflections that no longer belonged, voices that had become a language of absence and observation, layering upon each other in dissonant chorus. St. Mark's bells rang again, stretching beyond comprehension, curling over rooftops, bridges, and canals in endless spirals, marking not hours but the measured passage of lives toward the mist. Venice had become an organism of observation, patient and deliberate, measuring the slow unfolding of fear, the hesitant movements of the living, the soft tremors of breath. Each pause, each glance, each heartbeat was catalogued, absorbed into the pulse beneath the water, recorded in the rhythm of mist and fog. By the last toll, the Grand Canal lay still, the city suspended in silence, masks leaning, whispers climbing, shadows stretching, and those who had lingered too long found themselves unmoored, drifting toward absence, counted, measured, and swallowed into the deliberate, patient pulse of the midnight carnival. The carnival had reached its apex, a silent crescendo that pressed against the city like a living weight. Fog thickened, curling along facades and under bridges, coalescing into forms that mimicked human movement with eerie precision, drifting across canals in gestures too deliberate to be random. Each shape echoed the motions of those who had vanished, hands lifted in half gestures, heads tilting in almost recognizable nods, eyes wide and unblinking. Yet these were no longer the living, no longer shadows of memory, but specters rehearsing existence as if still learning to move through Venice. Gondolas drifted aimlessly among them, tethered to nothing, yet obeying some unseen pull, aligning with the rhythm of the mist and water, floating slowly as though conscious of the absence surrounding them. The masks on the few who remained leaned, tilting with intent, whispering in voices borrowed from lives long gone, repeating sins, secrets, half-remembered confessions, each syllable marking the listener, leaving an invisible line etched through memory, threading hesitation into the mind like a fine needle. The Grand Canal became a mirror not of stars or lanterns, but of time and impossibility, reflecting moments not yet lived, faces that should not exist, expressions that could not belong to any mortal soul. Those who dared to stare felt their own reflections twist subtly, pupils dilating with alien recognition, breaths caught between rhythm and hesitation, limbs moving slightly out of sync with intent, as if the body itself were negotiating with forces beneath the fog. Water rose and fell with a consciousness that seemed to taste each heartbeat, marking its tempo against the shifting forms above, pulsing in gentle, deliberate waves that carried the echo of absence. The architecture itself responded, shutters rattled with no wind, tiles shifted imperceptibly beneath the feet, parapets arched, bridges leaned, doors subtly realigned, all movements so slight as to be almost imperceptible yet enough to unsettle the mind, enough to suggest that the city was bending, reshaping itself to accommodate the carnival as well. Bells tolled again from St. Mark's belfry, their sound stretching impossibly long, curling over rooftops and across alleys, bending through the fog, resonating with the rhythm of the vanished. It was not a warning but a commemoration, a measure of those absorbed into the night, a signal to those who remained that the city no longer belonged solely to the living. The tolling echoed in the minds of pedestrians who had yet to disappear, vibrating through skull and spine, threading into thought as if the sound itself were capable of marking ownership, cataloging hesitation, and determining the inevitable. Shadows moved contrary to light, lengthening across stone and water, merging with fog forms that rehearsed human movements, each gesture precise, each sway of limb measured, like actors performing to an audience that had already left. Along narrow canals, masked figures leaned over the railings of gondolas, watching their own reflections in the water twist, mouths moving in silent whispers that borrowed voices from the absent. The water responded with subtle currents, rising and falling against the hulls, spinning gondolas slowly in place, aligning them to the rhythm of the fog, measuring hesitation, coaxing attention, drawing the living ever closer to the forms that hovered, uncertain, between reality and absence. Each whisper seemed to pull at memory, tugging at recollections of half-forgotten moments, layering sins, fears, and unspoken desires atop each other, until thoughts themselves felt borrowed from the fog, borrowed from the city, borrowed from the lost. Those who lingered felt the skin of their reflections press against their own, the eyes of the mirrored self too bright, too knowing, tilting toward recognition that was not their own. The fog thickened still further, pouring through alleys and archways, climbing stairwells, curling beneath balconies, brushing hands against collars and sleeves, wrapping around ankles, pressing into bones. The shapes of the vanished moved through it with a deliberate grace, their gestures precise, rehearsed, intimate with the spaces they now occupied. Gondolas drifted past, silent vessels carrying none but memories, reflections, and the ever-thickening mist. Lanterns swayed as though caught in invisible currents, casting light that illuminated shadows moving in impossible directions, reflections that contradicted the physical world, faces elongated, tilted, split into subtleties that unsettled vision and mind alike. The city had become an organism of observation, patient, deliberate, recording each pause, each hesitation, each heartbeat of those who remained, cataloging lives even as it reshaped the world around them to suit its own patient appetite. By the hour after midnight, Venice had ceased to exist as a city of stone and water, of commerce and lanterns. Canals, bridges, alleyways, and piazzas had bent subtly to the will of the mist and fog forms, reshaping paths, elongating steps, curling parapets, until even familiar streets became unfamiliar, a labyrinth designed to measure patience, fear, and curiosity. Masks leaned, whispered, tilted, reflections twisted, mirroring thoughts that were not yet thought, fears not yet acknowledged. Gondolas drifted tetherless, aligning with currents beneath the surface that had grown conscious, carrying passengers into rhythms older than memory. Lanterns cast light upon shadows that moved contrary to the source, and the fog whispered constantly, layering voices of the vanished atop those who still remained, teaching the city a language of absence and observation, a grammar of measured patience, until the night itself seemed infinite. By the hour approaching the first of dawn, the fog forms gathered along the banks, twisting into figures that nearly resembled the living, yet more perfect, more deliberate, each movement a measured echo of those who had disappeared. The water pulsed in time with them, carrying reflections that were not mirrors but presences, and the few who remained felt the boundaries of self and reflection blur, breath mingling with mist, thought folding into absence. Bells rang again, not to warn, not to signal, but to acknowledge, to record, to mark the passage of each into the rhythm of the night. Venice, now a city of fog, shadow, and reflection, waited with deliberate patience, ready to absorb the next hesitant soul, leaving only water, masks, and whispers to tell the story of what had been, what was, and what could never return. By the hour before dawn, Venice existed as a city untethered from memory, a labyrinth of impossibilities that pressed against reason like thick, wet fog. Bridges rose with impossible grace above canals that no longer followed maps or charts, their arches stretching higher than the tallest bell towers, curving into curves that folded back upon themselves, disappearing into mists so dense they seemed solid. Streets coiled in serpentine spirals, alleys curling inward then outward, leading pedestrians into loops where their own footsteps became echoes of themselves, steps measured against the pulse of water that moved with a patience older than history. The remaining gondolas floated without guidance, tetherless vessels drifting over currents that shimmered with voices borrowed from the absent, the air around them thick with whispers stitched from longing, guilt, and the echoing traces of vanished laughter. Lanterns swung from invisible hands, casting pools of orange light that illuminated masks dangling from walls, ceilings, and the twisted branches of skeletal trees, staring with fixed expressions that were both ornate and grotesque, smiles frozen in permanence, eyes hollow yet alert, each mask leaning subtly forward as if counting heartbeats and hesitation alike, whispering collectively in a language no living tongue could hold, a chorus composed of all those who had disappeared and all those yet to vanish. The canals themselves had become observant, reflective not only of light but of thought, ripples carrying the weight of memory, bending reality around each pedestrian who dared approach the edges. Water lapped against stone as if breathing, curling around gondolas in gentle eddies that guided them through passages unseen by the waking world. Those who paused, drawn to the soft allure of voices murmuring secrets that were never theirs to hear, found themselves swallowed by the fog, disappearing from sight without struggle, leaving behind only the faint scent of salt and damp wood, a whisper of movement on the water, and the gondola that continued to drift in silent obedience, spinning slowly as though considering the absence its next companion. Reflections on the surface of the canals betrayed subtle impossibilities, eyes that blinked independently of the wearer, lips that moved to form words unspoken, expressions that shifted between joy, fear, and accusation, a silent symphony of unease performed for a solitary audience of one, a city that had forgotten the living and remembered only absence. Masks multiplied across the cityscape, draping over parapets, hanging from doorways, clinging to bridges with unbroken vigilance. Each carried whispers of lives folded into the fog, repeating transgressions, unfinished thoughts, confessions never spoken aloud, their chorus layering into a melody that bent the mind, coaxed hesitation, and measured patience like a tide. Pedestrians felt their own voices stolen before forming sentences, words dissolving into the mist as masks leaned closer, tilting imperceptibly toward each hesitation, each measured breath, each heartbeat stretched into eternity. The streets responded. Cobblestones shifted subtly beneath footfalls, balconies leaned, and walls swayed almost imperceptibly, bending in ways that suggested a living city, one that had learned to observe, to anticipate, to claim those who lingered too long. Even the shadows had acquired intent, stretching unnaturally along surfaces, merging with fog forms that imitated life, twisting into angles impossible to reconcile with geometry, testing perception, eroding certainty. Bells rang in the distance, too slow, too long, a resonance that carried over the city with deliberate intent, marking the rhythm of those still present against those already absorbed into the labyrinth of fog and shadow. Each toll threaded through memory, tugging at recognition, pulling at guilt, exposing fears buried beneath centuries of calm nights and Venetian serenity. The mist responded, curling tighter around ankles, pressing against shoulders, brushing the hair, threading into pores, slipping into breath. The city exhaled with measured patience, its heartbeat echoing beneath stone, water, and mask, a pulse synchronized to the absence of those who had vanished, cataloging the hesitation of the living, drawing them closer with gentle insistence toward forms that mimicked presence but carried only reflection and echo. Reflections themselves became treacherous. Pedestrians who leaned over canal edges to glimpse faces in the water found mouths forming words that no tongue had spoken, eyes narrowing in recognition that was not their own, fingers reaching out to touch a reflection that shivered under contact, as if the water itself rejected intrusion. The gondolas, once vessels of navigation, moved autonomously, drifting into spirals where mists thickened, where light bent against perception, and where masks on walls leaned toward each other, whispering in unison, a language composed of absence, and the unbreachable space between living and vanished. Every footstep echoed too long, resonating through alleys that twisted impossibly, corridors that had no end, until pedestrians realized that their own paths were being measured, mapped, and altered, drawn into a rhythm older than Venice itself, one dictated by fog, masks, reflections, and the patient currents of water that had learned the names of those who walked too near. By the hour just before sunrise, the city no longer resembled Venice known to memory. Bridges, streets, and canals had coalesced into a labyrinthine organism of observation, patience, and whispering absence. Gondolas drifted in circles that never repeated, masks tilted toward the living with subtle insistence. Fog forms danced through impossible archways, and the water shimmered with voices from lives folded into history. Sunlight fractured through the mist, illuminating only endless canals, reflections that smiled crookedly, and a city that had become a vessel for all who had disappeared and all who remained too long. The chorus of whispers swelled, patient, deliberate, mocking, promising with cold certainty that the night would return, hungrier, more cunning, and more complete than ever before. Venice had become an organism, conscious and deliberate, a predator that measured breath, hesitation, and fear, and it waited with inexhaustible patience for the next soul drawn into its reflection, its fog, its endless canals. The city had claimed them all, or perhaps it had always been waiting for them to become part of it, a body without end, a memory without mercy, a carnival without dawn.